and thank you for joining us. My name is Aravind, and I'm extremely delighted to welcome all of you to our second webinar, which is part of our new series on the Right to Information Act called Conversations on Right to Information, anchored by Shailesh Gandhi ji. He's a very well-known activist, an RTI evangelist, and a former Central Information Commissioner. And I could not be more happier that we also have Wajahat Habibullah sir, the country's first ever Chief Information Commissioner. He's been a leading force after the Act came into existence, and he helped set up the institution. As the first Information Commissioner, he also paved the way for the future Central Information Commissioners. So allow me to take this chance to thank both Shailesh sir and Wajahat Habibullah sir. Thank you for joining us. For those of you who are new to us, Moneylife Foundation is a not-for-profit organization, and we primarily work in spreading financial literacy and advocacy for our savers. Our RTI Center, the Right to Information Center, which is supported by the Thakur Foundation, has been doing its best to promote the use of RTI in various ways, including the Right to Information app, something which we have recently come up with, which now allows you to ask questions about right to information to our panel of experts in any language by text, audio, or video. My colleague Akshay is going to post a link of the same in the chat in case you wish to download it. So please do have a look at that. And once again, before we officially begin, I would like to share a couple of ground rules so that the webinar is useful for all of us. We have kept all of you on mute during the session. This is for the benefit of all involved, and we will only unmute you during the Q&A. For optimal viewing, I'm going to request you to keep the webinar on speaker view. This entire meeting is being recorded, and a copy of this will be uploaded on our YouTube channel, Moneylife TV. During the Q&A, please use the raise hand button option that's available on Zoom. You can see that in the bottom or on your phones as well. Please feel free to use the chat section to share your comments, questions, observations. But please do not send us messages in private. Only use the public forum. We will not be able to respond to your messages in private. And I'm going to request all of you to keep your cameras switched off during the course of the presentation, because your backgrounds and your homes are visible. So in case you wish to keep your privacy intact, then please do. Without taking too much time, can I now request Shailesh Gandhi sir to please take over? Sir, over to you.
Thank you, Arvind, and thanks to Moneylife for this lovely initiative. It's giving me an opportunity to meet up with my old friends and have discussions with them on RTI, a subject we are all very passionate about. Wajahat Habibullah and I have a special relationship in a way. Since I was an entrepreneur all my life, I never had a boss, except my wife. When I joined the commission, Wajahat was the Chief Information Commissioner, and he was a very, very nice Chief Information Commissioner. I must concede that. And a very pro-transparency person. Apart from this, he's had a very varied life in various forms. He has been a bureaucrat most of his life. As far as I am aware, he was part of the team that was negotiating the Hazrat Bal affair, and I think he suffered a great accident because of a terrorist attack, is my impression. He's also a great transparency proponent, and I found him to be one of the best bureaucratic commissioners, or bureaucrats who had become commissioners in terms of transparency. Now I start this conversation with Wajahat. Wajahat, you were the first Chief Information Commissioner of the country, the Chief Central Information Commissioner of the country. What did you visualize RTI as happening, and how does it compare with what we are in 2021?
Well, I'll tell you the truth. When I was actually appointed Chief Information Commissioner, and I had accepted that over another offer as a Vice Chancellor of a university, which I earlier thought I was going to take, I was confused as to what exactly was so great about the right to information, because in my opinion, government had been fully transparent. And I'm telling you this only because an honest, straightforward bureaucrat like myself, as you have described me, had this impression that governance was in fact already transparent and already accountable. It didn't take me long after I joined the Information Commission to realize how wrong I had been. But mind you, it took me to join the Information Commission to actually see this, where I found that elementary kind of information, which I had always assumed was in the knowledge of the public, was in fact not in the knowledge of the public. The very simple situation of where my application has gone for an old age pension was an issue which I had to run around all over the place just to get that information. So once I joined and I actually started working on this, then of course my first target was to see that transparency actually came into governance. But as it grew, I realized that this was not simply a law. It was an event, a movement for social revolution, no less. And so I will answer your question, not from the point of view of simply how the law is being implemented. Your future questions are going to be addressing the issue, but the kind of social milieu that has been generated by the right to information. And I say that specifically because this very session of the Moneylife Foundation shows that an institution, a non-government institution like the Moneylife Foundation, is dedicating considerable time and experience to propagating the right to information. In other words, it is a mainstay for those who value freedom, for those who value democracy. And I have come to the conclusion that a democracy is to be judged not from the time that it holds elections or whether those elections are actually free and fair, but from the measure that that democracy is answerable to its actual owners. The actual government in a democracy is that of the people, for the people, by the people, and so on, is a well-known saying, but the implications of that were not always understood. Abraham Lincoln said the same. And therefore, I had felt, even by the time that I left the Information Commission after a full 5 years of service and the whole process had then started to move forward, the institutional framework was established. So when I left in 2010, I had expected that in the next decade, this would have transformed governance, transformed social relations, transformed political relations. Now, you will see, I don't have to elaborate how far we have come. There has been much progress, but it is nowhere near what I had expected it to be when I actually left. And I'll give you, it's actually left the commission. And I'll give you a very small example of how the RTI was at that time leading the way. You know that we, and you made, of course, extensive use of it, we were the first institution of that nature to introduce extensive video conferencing for our hearings. And at that time, I was in touch with both the High Courts and Supreme Court about making their hearings accessible through video conferencing. You know about that. You made extensive use of video conferencing. The Information Commission, and to this day, is making extensive use of video conferencing. And when you actually introduced it, my colleagues in the Information Commission felt that it was not going to work. And yet those very colleagues who objected to its introduction went far ahead of me in its use by the time I left the Information. And I only had this idea because, having worked in the office of the very computer-savvy Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi, had a knowledge of the fact that there was extensive computer coverage across the country. Otherwise, I would not even realize that. And in fact, my colleagues who were also from the service also had doubts, is there enough coverage? So that was when we were able to lead the way. And now you know, I quote, Supreme Court is using extensively the resource of video conferencing. That's just an example. Across the board, I had thought it would lead to far greater transparency, far greater, in consequence, integrity in politics, in administration. Now, I don't need to elaborate on that. You yourselves will be the best judge as to how far we have actually progressed. But since you'd asked me what my expectation, that was my expectation. And that expectation has not been met. But then perhaps I was too romantic to expect that that would be.
I think you're all very romantic. Yeah, in your first year as commissioner, there was a major controversy in Harabulo about file notings. And I know there's an interesting story behind it. I have heard you recount it. Would you like to share it with the participants today?
Well, it's I think an interesting story behind it. The very development of that whole process was very interesting. File notings under, in my reading of Section 4 of the Section 2F of the RTI Act, which defines information, is clearly information which needs to be disclosed. Also, in the definition of the right to information, the right to information covers every document. You know, as you and I have held, any ideas that I may have had about a certain thing, unless they're recorded, are not information. But if I've recorded those ideas, they are information. Therefore, file notings are information. It's interesting that when I started ruling that file notings are disclosable, it led to a very adverse reaction from within government. First, even my own, the DOPT, which was the administrative ministry for the Information Commission, started questioning my decision. So I had to tell them that I'm very sorry. You have no right to question my decision. You may be the administrative ministry, but I am the Chief Information Commissioner. Yet, on their website, they kept on this blurb that it includes all information except file notings, and then they started coming up with an amendment. Now, when the amendment came in, it caused a lot of agitation. I think you were among the agitators yourselves. But I remember my colleague, now present colleague, Maya Daruwala, who used to be the head of CHRI at that time, calling on me and asking whether I agreed with this idea of the amendment. And I felt that bringing such an amendment would cut at the root of transparency, which the government, country, or the parliament wished to promote through the RTI Act. So she said, then, will you resign if the amendment is passed? I said that no, I will not, because I am an instrument appointed by government. The point that I'm trying to make is the role of the Information Commissioner, Information Commissions, and the Chief Information Commissioner particularly, is interesting. On the one hand, he is the guardian of a fundamental right, the right to accountability and transparency of the public. On the other hand, he is also the lion under the throne, if I may put it that way. A person who is expected to protect the government's interests. But then the protect state interest, because the Information Commission is an instrument of the state. But this takes you back even further, because what is the state? The state is its people in a democracy. The state is its people. So if you're protecting the interest of the state, you're protecting the public interest. And therefore you can imagine the thoughts and the dilemma that was before me when Maya suggested this. I was an instrument of the government, but as an instrument of the government, I was also an instrument of the public. And here was the public making a certain demand on me as a guardian of their right. So I suppose that's an interesting dilemma. As it happened, the government under Dr. Manmohan Singh agreed that since this issue had so agitated the public, the amendment would be withdrawn. But it's interesting because the amendment was not really withdrawn. It continued. And this also got disclosed through a right to information law, whereby the information was refused by the cabinet secretary and had to take the plea that the action is not complete. Meant the law was still pending before the the amendment was still pending before the courts, before Parliament, because the action was not complete, which is the reason that it can be given if an item is not to be disclosed after it has been closed, after it's been finished. So there were a whole lot of interesting ramifications. But yes, the fact that the government admitted that the file notings are part of the right to information was in fact a major step forward in making the right to information real. So that is what I have to say about that particular amendment.
If you recall, you mentioned amendments, Wajahat. The government that brought in our right to information made 3 attempts to amend the law. And the last one, the current government made 1 attempt and did not listen to people and passed it. The earlier 3 were given up. Do you recall that? And therefore, from the citizen perspective, from my perspective, basically officials, everybody in power does not like right to information. Do you think that's, or not everybody, that would be an exaggeration. Most people in power do not like right to information.
No, the right to information has exposed a degree of skullduggery, even corruption, at certain levels, particularly the clerical levels of government. It's interesting that this is, the privatization. It is particularly important that this right came in at the time of privatization. Because up to the time of privatization, there was a standard there were standard corruption levels. You could expect you had to pay so much to get something, because the procedures of government were absolutely standardized. After privatization and what was called liberalization, the standardized procedures all dissolved because there were no licenses and so on and so forth. Otherwise, you had to pay so much for a license and so on and so forth. This changed. The right to information acted as a counter to this because it meant that you had to give reasons why you were actually doing something or not doing something. So that, of course, at a certain level of government, as I said, caused an adverse reaction. On the other hand, at certain other levels of government, it brought the reaction that because there's a right to information, we are protected. That was a class of civil servants, and please acknowledge that there is such a class. It's a fairly widespread class of civil servants who value their integrity, who honor their integrity. Both financial, of course, but intellectual. Intellectual even more than financial. And they felt that the right transformation gave them the strength to actually assert their opinion without fear of adverse reaction by the political leadership. I don't mean to imply that political leadership is inherently corrupt and my colleagues in the bureaucracy are inherently very honest. This is a mixed bag, and you know it. But at least to those who valued their integrity, it was a support base. Now, you would have to judge as to whether it was appreciated by the bulk of the bureaucracy or not. On this meter, those who value the right to information are those who value upholding of integrity in governance. And by integrity, I don't only mean financial. Those who are dismissive of that integrity would also be dismissive of the RTI Act. Now, the interesting point is, and I told you I'm an inherent romantic, we have today a yin and a yang in terms of the right to information, a thesis and an antithesis. I don't think I need to elaborate on what that is, but that is a thesis and an antithesis that is at present being played out.
My perception is slightly different from yours, Wajahat, coming from the civil side.
You always have been, and that's been the source of endless arguments between us. But please go ahead.
Absolutely. My perception is that the corrupt dislike RTI for obvious reasons, who are in power. The honest and those with integrity feel upset that their actions are questioned and somebody says, why did this happen or why did that happen? Because they have the arrogance of believing we are working in public interest. So that way, I feel, I'm not saying everybody dislikes RTI, but a significant proportion of people in power, including courts and judges, are not really in favor of RTI.
Well, courts and judges, some yes. Again, my analysis will apply there also, and I would stand with my definition. Maybe my definition springs from the fact that I am one of the flock, and you would like to think of yourself as a shepherd, but the flock may not agree.
Okay. Let's look at a slightly ticklish point. What should be the criteria for selecting information commissioners? Should there be a criteria? Or what's the current process? According to you, what's the current process?
The current process and the processes before this have all been detected. And what is the outcome? You know, Mr. Chidambaram has been talking in terms of outcomes. What has been the outcome of the selection process? That is clear. Election process so far has resulted in an overloading of bureaucrats into all of those positions. Whereas the law is very clear, it is not a position in the position of an information commission, and your own appointment and evidence of that. You were one of the more bitter critics of the Information Commission. At one time, I was sitting as Chief Information Commissioner, and you were nibbling away at my heels.
Even now I am.
Well, you were not nibbling away at my heels.
No.
But anyway, the point is that this was, I was, one of my jobs was to call in people like yourselves and Arvind Kejriwal and try to convince you that the way that I was going was the right way, and I failed usually to convince. But nevertheless, that is dialectics. That is interaction. That is what the right to information was supposed to promote. But now you see the question. Now, can I go back to? Can you repeat that question?
Just a minute. Sorry to interrupt you, Wajahat. No, I'm not looking at it from the bureaucrat, non-bureaucrat perspective. I'm saying what should be the qualities of an information commissioner.
Quality of the information commissioner. I was coming to that. Now, the quality of the information commissioner should be one who is a person who is, of course, experienced, but one who is always willing to listen to criticism. Always they're willing to respond to criticism. And if I pride myself on any achievement that I may have had in the Information Commission, it is this, that I was able to listen to and even learn from a great deal of it. You know that my website was open, my email was open. I had given out my cell number to the public, in the public domain. My email was open to the public. And a lot of people would send me on Facebook and others information which is actually highly abusive. I didn't mind it. I didn't mind it. Even in that abusive emails, I found that there was something that I could learn. Now, I don't say that I was a model information commissioner. I was only citing that because the information commissioners have to be absolutely transparent and accountable in themselves. It doesn't matter what service they come from. It doesn't matter where they are from. It matters that they should be eminent people. And therefore, having a committee actually judge that high level of...
So should they have some demonstrated inclination for transparency?
Yes. Yes. They should have demonstrated persons of integrity and accountability who are appointed to the position of information commissioner for that reason. Not because they held the post of secretary to something or the other, or even because of a particular position that they held, but for this. Now, this is something that, again, I will have to say, I have to excuse myself by saying that I'm very romantic, but because nowhere is that principle actually followed. But I had hoped it would be followed in the case of the Information Commission, and I had also acted upon it. Because when I was handing over, I had gone to Prime Minister Dr. Manmohan Singh and suggested names. Now, I will not mention those names now. You know them and others know them. I had mentioned names which were outside, much to the irritation of many of my colleagues in the service. But I had, because, as I said, I'd mentioned those, but I had not kept these things secret, because I was, again, an advocate. I had been converted to an advocate of transparency. They didn't approve of my having done so, and that proposal was also undone. But the fact is that I had made that initiative, and I would still believe that the door is still open. The government can still take that path, because the rules for appointing information commissioners do not rule against appointing information commissioners on those grounds.
You were pushing for the Jammu and Kashmir RTI Act considerably, and I think you had a very big hand in getting it passed or getting it approved. I have been part of your team on that. The Jammu and Kashmir RTI Act had a provision that commissions shall decide in 45 days. The Indian commissions nowadays are making right to information, right to history. What do you feel?
Well, yes, learning from the experience of the Chief Central Information Commission, I had in fact ensured that the Information Act of J&K had that provision. It also had a limited number of information commissioners. But As you know, there is no state of J&K anymore. It's a union territory, and therefore there is no J&K Right to Information Act anymore. That comes under the Central Information Act, the Right to Information Act. And there's certain positive aspects, elements of that also, and also, unfortunately, some sad elements that those progressive components of that law are no longer there. But if your question is, was the State Information Commission able to act on that? To some extent, yes. To some extent, yes. Their speed of disposal was much faster, but again, that's partly because the number of cases they had before was also much lower. And the Central Information Commission has to deal with a rather voluminous number of cases which are coming to them, and that is for other reasons, because of the fact of the inadequate implementation of Section 4. Therefore, you get a larger number of cases in complaint and appeal before the Information Commission, which should not be there, but that's another issue altogether.
In terms of Section 4 that you mentioned, Wajahat, would it not be fantastic if most government offices work paperless and put up everything that they do on the web each evening? You would not need to do anything else.
It would be, and it is also an objective of the government. You yourself have tried in your Office of Information Commissioner to make it a paperless office. I remember we were all a bit concerned because we felt, the old-fashioned bureaucrats like ourselves, without putting a pen to paper, we don't feel we've done a job at all. But yes, you did take a lead in the Information Commission by having paperless offices, and the objective of the current government, as well as the previous government, was to have paperless offices. But I leave you to judge. You yourselves can see how far we have gone in that direction. This is not to say that the government has not been able to implement the Section 4 at all. There has been, a considerable transparency introduced into government. Certain things which you found inaccessible altogether are now accessible, particularly in matters of routine, like driving licenses, passports, and so on, which are matters that really concern daily life of the public. Certainly there has been improvement. But if you ask as to whether government itself the system itself has become more transparent and accountable, I'm afraid I will have to agree with you that it hasn't, which was the objective of the RTI Act.
Another thought, a lot of government departments now have complete running of the administration through computer programs like SAPs and so on. And they have dashboards which are visible only to the government officials, not to the citizens. Would it be a good idea to make most of these dashboards, barring a few, open to public?
Of course.
And this is something that can be done tomorrow.
That is in fact Section 4 of the RTI Act. It's not supposed to be information that is all disclosed on the website for the information of your colleagues themselves. It is information to be disclosed for the information of the public, on the presumption that the public is the government. The people sitting in the government are only representatives of the public. But that is how, these are nuances. And this is how the law has not come up to what you had asked me I expected from it when I actually took over as chief.
If you will recall, you had given a decision saying that the PM's National Relief Fund is a public authority, in my case, much before I became a commissioner. Funnily enough, after that decision, the PM's office didn't give information, and then of course I became a commissioner, so I stopped asking. In 2013, the PM National Relief Fund went and challenged and said, we are not a public authority and the matter is languishing in some various courts. The same applies to PM Cares, National Stock Exchange. There also commissions have ruled that they are public authorities, but they are whiling away time in the various court processes. Section 23 categorically makes it clear that the final appeal will lie with the commission. Now, the writ jurisdiction of high courts is available, but I think they take everything as a writ. So the law is actually getting destroyed, and the device of going to courts will narrate anything that the commissions do.
No, I would not agree with you there, because in many ways, the decisions of the courts have been very constructive. Thanks to decisions of the courts, you have the Indian Olympic Association, you have the Commonwealth Games Association, all these became public authorities. A large number of private sector units have become public authorities. NGOs have become public authorities, but yes, it's a mixed bag. In certain cases, the courts have, and recently the issue of the collegium has attracted a lot of public debate. You remember that I had ruled that the collegium has to be, its actions have to be transparent. This is not done, because the way the collegium of the Supreme Court was functioning was that it was all functioning on the basis of input by one or other member without the collegium ever meeting. And a number of organizations of this nature, so the collegium minutes were never made public. Well, I had ruled that, well, leading up to the meeting, yes, you can keep it confidential. Up to the time of appointment of a judge, you can keep it confidential. But you have to make it public after the appointment is made. That is as per the law. Not done, and that is still pending. A number of such issues are pending in the courts. So the courts also must get their act together. They have to be told to pull their socks up. Now, this is a job which the Information Commission could do. You do realize that I had several times admonished the court, and on the basis of that admonition, they had actually changed their rules. Delhi High Court, for example, changed the rules altogether on the basis of advice given by the Information Commission. Now, if I give them advice on how they have to respond to the right to information, it doesn't mean that I am trying to assert my superiority over this. It simply means that so far as the right to information is concerned, I am the supreme authority.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So your question is answered in that way. Unfortunately, and I was disappointed. And I also, in fact, went and spoke to my former successors in the information that they had, ruled on the status of political parties under the right to information. In doing so, they had actually set aside, overridden an order that I had done. But I fully supported the order of the Information Commission, because it was done after careful thought and well argued. But then this matter became infructuous because the Information Commission wouldn't enforce it. The Information Commission must enforce its own orders. It's no use saying that there are no contempt of court proceedings. It's contempt of court the only way of enforcing your orders. The law is very liberal in supporting judicial or quasi-judicial authorities in implementing their orders. And it's not for me to now at this stage, this is the way and that is the way. I am not in the Information Commission anymore. But I would plead with my colleagues in the Information Commission to take another look, which is what I did when I went. And in that case, of course, I recommended to them how, in fact, they could remedy the situation, which I'm afraid they didn't act.
Before we go to the participants' questions, you've written this book, Your Years with Rajiv Gandhi. I've heard from you that he was clearly pro-transparency. Would you like to recount something out of that?
Well, I don't know if I can give you an example There would, of course, be many examples, but he was, we had, in fact, as I've written in the book, we had been in school together and so on. So I was, and I had been in Mrs. Gandhi's office, and then I became director and then joint secretary in his office. So I had to be always very conscious of the fact that he was my prime minister. But that didn't prevent me from actually discussing and even arguing matters with him. But one issue which he was very strong on was the question of accountability. Not so much transparency, but accountability. And he was initially under the impression that accountability, and accountability to whom? To the people, to the public. And therefore, in his initial years, he was very conscious of the fact that the cutting edge, what he called the cutting edge of administration, was the district. And that the district magistrate was the means for the government to communicate with the people. I, of course, argued with him on that. And I said that that doesn't happen because the district magistrate is a little emperor in the district to whom access is not readily available, and therefore it all developed onto the concept of Panchayati. Panchayati Raj, as conceived by him, which jogging is no doubt should be, was as a unit of self-government. That means a unit of the administration, not simply a development organ of the administration, which is what it is now, but an actual unit of the administration, fulfilling administrative function at the village level, like land, schools, running primary health centers, these things. But it didn't quite come out that way because when the 73rd and 74th amendments actually came into operation, they weren't quite as expansive as that. I had the opportunity of actually trying to implement what we had discussed and had come up with something called the Island Development Council in Lakshadweep, where I had made the Island Development Council the actual administrator, answerable to the administrator of Lakshadweep. The powers of the collector were exercised by the Island Development Council. But that is altogether another story. But this, the question of accountability and the question of transparency and accountability came from his, and that brought to this realization that to be transparent, there has to be an institutional framework whereby the public can actually demand from the government its answer. And therefore, there had to be a third tier of legislature. And as you know, the way the 73rd Amendment is coined, every villager is a legislator in actual fact. Because the Gram Sabha is the legislature of the Panchayat. And how it was designed to become was the district magistrate would simply be the chief executive of the Zilla Parishad. The Zilla Parishad would be at the highest level of the Panchayati Raj. And the programs and the administration would flow in that direction. In other words, BDOs, BLWs, Patwaris would all come under the orders of Panchayats. And the DM would be the chief executive through whom they would run. But that was after leaving Rajiv's office. In fact, I myself developed a kind of commitment to this idea of public participation in governance and went on to being Secretary Panchayati Raj and so on. But that idea really came from my discussion, not that I said that Rajiv himself started this idea, but we came to this idea by mutual discussion that the ultimate test of a democracy is the extent to which public participates in governance. And the right to information, and of course not at this time but afterwards, was seen as an instrument of public participation. And you will remember that even as Chief Information Commissioner, this is a point that I kept on reiterating. So the right to information calls for public participation in governance, and the law is also drafted that, particularly in the way in which it says that the public can petition the government on asking for any schemes or asking for thinking that's gone into any policy making. All this comes under Section 4. That you have to disclose all the details of how you arrived at a certain policy. And a person has the right to ask as to why did you arrive at such and such policy? And such
You could go on. You could go on for a very long time, but there is a time limitation, and I think the participants would like to raise some queries. And in particular, I think Lokesh Batra would like to raise a query. And I think he's joined already. Arvind, please unmute Lokesh Batra if you can.
Can I ask a query before we
Please, please.
Mr. Habibullah, you and Shailesh were part of the first Central Information Commission, and it is going to be 16 years since then, since the enactment of the Act. And I think it's during your tenures that you had a lot of decisions about certain organizations like the National Stock Exchange, which is a first-line regulator, or as someone in the chat has asked, the Indian Banks Association. Most of these decisions happened at that time. And these organizations have gone to court even after they have lost before a single judge bench. They've gone to a division bench, and they're gaming the judicial system to buy time. Don't you think that the ministries, who are the administrative ministries, could easily end this litigation by issuing a notification that people who have to deal with the public, like the IBA or the National Stock Exchange or the Bombay Stock Exchange, the first line regulator, should come under the Act? Why are they allowed to keep using or misusing the judicial system for so long? Would you like to comment on that?
Yes, the law itself states that every law is subject to the right to information. So the legislature, even if the departments don't do that, that is the case. Unfortunately, the record of the courts, although, as you know, the very idea of the right to information being a fundamental right sprang from a decision of the Supreme Court. The courts have got some landmark judgments in their favor. But I know that Shailesh will disagree with me because he feels the courts have been unfair. In fact, they were quite unfair to Shailesh because his decisions on penalties were generally sort of cast aside by the courts without really going into details of the need for those penalties and so on. But putting that aside, your suggestion, of course, is a good one. But again, it will depend upon the courts. Because the person who have taken it, the court will again take it for that same reason. So I think that what needs to be developed, and which I thought would be developed in answer to Shailesh's question, I said that I thought that a kind of atmosphere of transparency, an atmosphere of openness would come into society, into governments, and into society in consequence of the right to information law, apart from simply the legal aspects. That has not happened. That has not happened, and the reason why it has not happened is why we are still, and unfortunately I have to say so, even though I have been part of the service myself, we are still the remains of a colonial structure which is based on mistrust of its own people. And this structure is now stationed in the center of a system which depends on trusting each other, which has to depend on mutual trust. And the RTI Act is an instrument to do that. But I had disagreed with my colleagues like Shailesh, who earlier described it as a weapon. But I'm increasingly thinking that it is a weapon and has to be used as a weapon in order to achieve its ends, because simply as a means, it will not be used to prise open those jammed doorways which have remained jammed and tightly shut for all these decades.
Lokesh Batra.
Able to speak right now. I've unmuted you.
Am I audible?
Yes, I can hear you, but you have to speak a little louder.
Good evening to all of you, and greetings from USA. Sir,
Thank you.
I am so, I mean, when you mentioned about your...
A small interruption, Lokesh. Please keep it to about 60 seconds.
Oh, I'll do
80
that.
seconds, Arvind will unmute.
Okay, sir. What I'm saying is that when Wajahat mentioned about his email and availability of email and mobile number, I totally agree. Before one could send an email to him, you wait for only 5 seconds and the response was always there. Now I'm coming to the main point. The issue is, sir, if you recollect, as early as 2009, I was in Boston and I asked for hearing. The only reservation you send me on it will be 2:30 night in USA. I say, I have no problem. And sure enough, in the time, I get a call, yourself dialed it, and Wajahat here. And we went through the hearing. But unfortunately, the other thing when we are talking of video call, that was through NIC, where people had to visit the center. Today, the scenario is that there are links given to the petitioners or whoever are involved in that case, and you can do it from anywhere in the world. That is what I am saying CSC need to create. On the other hand, I'm talking now my personal, large number of my cases, including COVID-oriented, which are supposed to have priority, are pending because there's a senior representative, we can't hold the hearing. This is the reverse what has happened in recent time. I mean, since I have 60 seconds, I can't give you in details. Thank you so much.
Well, I don't know if I can give you a response. I'm sad to hear that. That is all I can say. But Moneylife can probably please convey this, as I hope you will convey the responses in this to the information, to the chief information, to the current chief information.
Sir, I've spoken to the Chief Information Commissioner on this, and they don't seem to be wanting to do anything.
You have spoken to him, but you may also add Lokesh Bhatta's voice to yours.
Okay, sure, sir. Okay,
and
next,
Lokesh Bhatta is a military man, so his voice is a good deal more formidable.
Arvind, any other participants who would like to?
Subhash sir has raised his hand. I have actually given him the chance to unmute, but I don't think he has done that. Subhash sir, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, but my video is not starting.
Yeah, sure, sir. I think we are able to hear you as well.
नमस्ते सर, मेरे को पता है आप तो
कैसे हैं आप?
बहुत बढ़िया जी। मेरे को पता है कि आप तो एक तरीके से लोगों के गालियां भी ईमेल पे लिखते थे, बड़े ग्लैडली एक्सेप्ट करते थे।
लेकिन वो मेरे बड़े अच्छे दोस्त भी बन गए बाद में।
अच्छा सर, मैं ये कह रहा था, अभी आपने दिल्ली हाई कोर्ट का जिक्र किया कि उन्होंने अपने रूल्स भी चेंज किए, सब कुछ किए, और वो रूल्स ऐसे बना दिए थे जो एक्ट के खिलाफ थे। आज भी सेक्शन 27 और 28 में स्टेट्स को और कॉम्पिटेंट अथॉरिटीज को फीस अपने निर्धारित करने का हक है, और कईयों ने फर्स्ट अपील के लिए भी फीस लगा रखी है। हमें पता नहीं किस स्टेट में है या नहीं है। तो क्या ये कम से कम फीस के मामले में यूनिफॉर्मिटी नहीं होनी चाहिए? दूसरा ये कि कई स्टेट्स ने जो ऑनलाइन अपना पोर्टल है वो बिल्कुल बेकार कर रखा है। जैसे उड़ीसा में है, वो कहते हैं ऑनलाइन फाइल कर दो पर उसका प्रिंट लेके और हमें स्पीड पोस्ट से भेजो। तो देन व्हाट इज द यूज ऑफ ऑनलाइन पोर्टल? तो ऑनलाइन पोर्टल में क्या यूनिफॉर्मिटी नहीं होनी चाहिए फीस और ऑनलाइन पोर्टल में?
मैं इससे इत्तेफाक नहीं करूंगा कि यूनिफॉर्मिटी होनी। ये जो अधिनियम बनाया गया है, यह इस प्रकार से बनाया गया है कि जो फेडरल प्रिंसिपल जो है उसका वो नष्ट ना हो। किंतु इसीलिए हम हर साल ये कन्वेंशन करते थे ताकि होमोजीनियटी हो, लेकिन यूनिफॉर्मिटी नहीं। किंतु ये जो बात आप उठा रहे हैं, इसमें तो ऐसा है कि वेबसाइट होना तो लाजमी है। इट इज कंपल्सरी। तो वेबसाइट रखना और वो नाकाम हो तो दैट इज नॉट परमिसिबल। तो इसमें ये है कि अगर यूनिफॉर्मिटी भी ना हो, किंतु जो अधिनियम के तहत दर्ज हैं क्लॉजेस, उनका पालन बिल्कुल होने की आवश्यकता है। और आप पाएंगे कि अगर उनका पालन पूरी तरह से होता है तो इस प्रकार की कमियां नहीं रहेगी। इस समय मुख्य सूचना आयुक्त का रोल एक है, अवश्य उनकी नोटिस में अगर ये बात लाई जाए तो वे लिख सकते राष्ट्रीय मतलब राज्य सूचना आयोग, और उनको ये मशवरा दे सकते, नॉट नेसेसरीली ऑर्डर्स, आदेश देने के इसमें नहीं दे सकते अवश्य, किंतु वो मशवरा अवश्य दे सकते हैं कि इन चीजों में सुधार।
गुड इवनिंग टू ऑल जेंटल इंडियंस।
गुड इवनिंग
सर, मेरा एक प्रश्न है कि राज्य सूचना आयोग या केंद्रीय सूचना आयोग की जवाबदेही तय होनी चाहिए। सब मैकेनिज्म में राज्य सूचना आयोग या केंद्रीय सूचना आयोग में जो लंबित अपीलों के निस्तारण की विधि अब तक हमारे पास नहीं है। हम किस अपील को कितने दिनों में निस्तारित करेंगे, कोई रूल्स नहीं है। ऑल द फंडामेंटल राइट्स का ये स्पष्ट वायलेशन करता है आयोग।
राज्य सूचना आयोग से अपील केंद्रीय सूचना आयोग को नहीं हो सकती है।
नहीं सर, मैं वो नहीं कह रहा हूँ। तो
कहिए।
He means for state information commissioners and central. He is counting in that way.
Sorry, I couldn't get the.
What he's trying to say is that in all commissions, the time for disposal of the case is very long. That destroys the fundamental right. In short,
वही एक प्रश्न आपको याद है कि शैलेश जी ने किया, अधिनियम में कोई इस पे सीमा लगाई नहीं गई है अपील पे सूचना आयोग के पास। जब हम भी सूचना आयोग, शैलेश जी और मैं सूचना आयोग में थे, तब भी हमने इस पे काफी बहस की, होना चाहिए कि नहीं होना चाहिए, किंतु उस समय भी ये जो लंबाई थी और लंबी होती गई, और अब तो काफी लंबी हो गई है। साल 1.5 साल लग जाता है, 2 साल लग जाता है निर्णय लेने में, जब तक कि, और सूचना का अधिनियम लगाया इसलिए गया था ताकि जल्दी जल्दी उत्तर मिल सके, सूचना जो प्राप्त करनी है वो मिल सके। तो अवश्य ये एक समस्या है, लेकिन समस्या इसलिए है क्योंकि मैंने पहले भी कहा है, क्योंकि ये सूचना आयोग पे अधिक बोझ डाल दिया गया है, इसलिए कि धारा 4 जो है अधिनियम की, उसकी संपूर्ण पालन नहीं हुआ। मतलब अगर अधिक से अधिक सूचना को पारदर्शित कर दिया जाए कार्यालय के अंदर ही, उसमें ना सूचना प्राप्त करने के लिए किसी ने अप्लाई करना होगा, ना फिर उसमें ये प्रश्न उठेगा कि सूचना दिया जाए या ना दिया जाए, न सिर्फ ये न फिर कोई अपील होगी, न सूचना आयोग के पास या सूचना आयोग के पास अपील इस प्रकार की आएगी। तो पालन, अधिनियम का पालन, संपूर्ण पालन करना लाजमी। अगर यह किया जाए तो मेरे विचार में इसमें काफी सुधार आ सकता है, वरना एक संशोधन होने की आवश्यकता होगी कि सीमा की जो अपील है वो सीमित कर दी जाए, इतने महीनों में या इतने सालों में जो भी उचित समझा जाए उस पे सीमा लगाने की आवश्यकता पड़ेगी। किंतु फिर भी जैसे मैंने कहा, मेरा ये विचार है कि अगर अधिनियम का पालन पूरी तरह से किया जाए तो फिर ये समस्या उठेगी।
Thank you very much, Wajahat. This was a brilliant presentation, and request everyone to start their videos, don't unmute them, and let's give a round of applause, which we can all see. Thank you, Wajahat.
Thank you.